Picture this. You're scrolling through your phone, judging some stranger's terrible behavior online, when suddenly a chilling thought creeps in. What if that could be you? What if the person you see in the mirror each morning, decent, moral, well-intentioned, is just one bad situation away from becoming the villain in someone else's story? Before you dismiss this as impossible, let me tell you something that'll shake you to your core. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us over a century ago. He who fights monsters should be careful, lest he thereby become a monster. The philosopher wasn't being dramatic. He was being prophetic. You see, there's this uncomfortable truth that most of us refuse to face. You're not as far from becoming a monster as you'd like to believe. I know. You return lost wallets. You help old ladies cross the street. You donate to charity. But here's the thing that'll make you squirm in your seat. Have you ever taken something that wasn't yours just because you knew you wouldn't get caught? Maybe just a pen from work, or used your neighbor's Wi-Fi without asking. There's a reason I'm asking these seemingly innocent questions, and it ties directly into what psychologist Philip Zimbardo discovered in his groundbreaking research on human evil. Zimbardo's work, particularly his infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, reveals something that should terrify you. Evil isn't some distant force that only affects other people. It's a slippery slope that starts with small, seemingly insignificant compromises with your moral code. Take the case of even Chip Frederick, an all-American soldier who loved baseball and believed in serving his country. Before his deployment to Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, Frederick was as ordinary as they come, stable, decent, unremarkable. But that place, that system, warped him into something unrecognizable. And if you think you're fundamentally different from Frederick, you're setting yourself up for a rude awakening. The truth is, your character isn't carved in stone like you've been told. It's more like sand, constantly shifting with the tides of your environment. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist, understood this better than most when he introduced the concept of the shadow, that dark part of your personality that you refuse to acknowledge exists. Jung believed that everyone carries this shadow self, these repressed impulses and capacity for evil that we desperately try to keep hidden. The more you deny this shadow exists, the more power it has over you when the right circumstances arise. Now let me paint you an even more disturbing picture. Imagine you're participating in Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment. You're the teacher, tasked with administering electric shocks to a learner every time they make a mistake. The shocks start mild, but they keep escalating. Soon you're at 450 volts, enough to kill someone. The person in the next room is screaming, begging you to stop, but a guy in a lab coat keeps telling you to continue. What do? Here's what'll blow your mind. 65% of ordinary people, folks just like you, delivered the maximum voltage. They weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were regular people who got caught in what existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith. They deceived themselves about their moral choices, hiding behind the authority figure's commands to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Sartre argued that we're condemned to be free, meaning we always have choices, even when we pretend we don't. This brings us to Zimbardo's most controversial experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Picture 24 college students, all psychologically sound and middle class, randomly divided into guards and prisoners in a mock jail. The guards got uniforms, batons, and mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes and, symbolically, their humanity. The prisoners, stripped, deloused, and reduced to numbers instead of names. What happened next should haunt you. Within days, these normal college kids transformed into sadistic guards who forced prisoners to urinate in buckets, stripped them naked, and locked them in dark closets. One guard even earned the nickname John Wayne for his brutal methods. 6 days. That's all it took for Zimbardo to shut down the experiment, because it had spiraled so far out of control. But here's the philosophical kicker that Nietzsche would have appreciated. The guards didn't become monsters because they were inherently evil. They became monsters because they embraced what Nietzsche called the will to power, that fundamental drive to dominate and control others that exists within all of us. When given the right situation and justification, this will to power can transform anyone into a tyrant. So what exactly tips the scales? What makes someone like Frederick or those Stanford guards descend into moral darkness while others resist? The answer lies in a toxic combination of factors that Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, identified in her study of Nazi war crimes. Arendt coined the phrase, the banality of evil, after observing Adolf Eichmann's trial. She realized that evil doesn't require monsters, it just requires thoughtless conformity and obedience to authority. Whether it's a person, an institution, or a set of rules, authority can compel even the most righteous among you to commit unspeakable acts. Look at the Jonestown massacre, where over 900 people died, not because they were evil, but because they were obedient to charismatic leader Jim Jones. His followers trusted him, obeyed him, even when he handed them cups of cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. So here's an uncomfortable question. How many times have you followed orders, not because they were right, but because they were easier than questioning authority? But authority isn't the only culprit in this moral horror story. There's another insidious factor at play: the loss of personal responsibility through what psychologists call de-individuation. It's the reason people in mobs wear masks, why soldiers don uniforms, and why internet trolls hide behind anonymous usernames. Once you feel like your actions can't be traced back to you personally, it becomes alarmingly easy to cast off moral restraints. Zimbardo demonstrated this with a chilling field experiment. He left an abandoned car in the Bronx where anonymity reigned supreme, and within hours it was stripped bare and destroyed. But that same car in Palo Alto, a tight-knit community where people would be recognized, sat untouched. The message is crystal clear. When the cloak of anonymity descends, when responsibility gets diffused among a crowd, evil finds fertile ground to grow. Then there's the final piece of this moral puzzle: dehumanization. How do you get someone to commit atrocities against fellow human beings? Simple. Convince them that those others aren't really human at all. It's a psychological sleight of hand that has justified some of history's worst horrors. Albert Bandura's research at Stanford showed that when people were described in dehumanizing terms, called animals and savages, the punishments inflicted on them were far harsher than those given to people described as perceptive and understanding. This twisted logic fueled the rape of Nanking, where Japanese soldiers unleashed unimaginable brutality on Chinese civilians they'd been taught to see as subhuman. And before you think this belongs to some distant past, take a closer look at your world today. How often do you hear certain groups described as animals, scum, or vermin? The moment you stop seeing someone as fully human is the moment you crack open the door to your own dark potential. Making matters worse, there's the seductive power of euphemistic language, those sanitized words that make evil sound noble. This is what turns torture into enhanced interrogation and genocide into ethnic cleansing. These aren't just word games, they're psychological cover stories that allow perpetrators to sleep soundly at night. The participants in Milgram's experiment were told they were contributing to science and helping improve memory when they were actually inflicting what they believed to be real pain on another human being. Fast forward to Abu Ghraib, where torture wasn't presented as an atrocity, but as essential action in the war on terror, necessary to protect national security. Soldiers operating under this ideological cover believed they were the good guys, even as they committed acts the world would later condemn. It's a grim reminder that when language gets twisted and narratives get manipulated, even the most heinous actions can be rationalized and justified. But here's where the story takes a turn toward hope, because if there's one thing Zimbardo's research teaches us, it's that you still have a choice. You might be walking a tightrope over the moral abyss, but that doesn't mean you have to fall. The capacity for evil may lurk within you, but so does the capacity for what Zimbardo calls heroic imagination. What separates a hero from a potential monster? It's not superhuman strength or unshakable confidence. It's the willingness to act when others freeze up. Take Wesley Autry, the subway hero of New York, who didn't hesitate when he saw a man having a seizure fall onto the train tracks. While others stood paralyzed, Autry jumped down, pressed the man between the rails, and shielded him as the train thundered overhead. This is heroism in its purest form. Not grand gestures on a battlefield, but decisive moral action in everyday situations. The philosophical foundation for this heroism comes from thinkers like Kant, who gave us the categorical imperative: act only according to principles you'd want to become universal laws. Before you follow that order or join that mob, ask yourself, would I want everyone to act this way? It's about taking what Sartre called radical responsibility for your choices, acknowledging that even in the most constraining circumstances, you retain the freedom to choose your response. Building this moral resilience requires daily practice. Aristotle understood that virtue isn't a destination, it's a practice. Every small act of moral courage, every time you question authority instead of blindly following, every moment you choose to see the humanity in others rather than reducing them to labels, these are the building blocks of heroic character. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher emperor, taught that we should focus on what we can control, our thoughts, our choices, our responses to circumstances. You can't control the situations you'll face, but you can control how you respond to them. This is where your power lies, not in avoiding all moral tests, but in preparing yourself to pass them. So here's the uncomfortable truth wrapped in hope. You do have the potential to become a monster under the right circumstances, but you also have the potential to become a hero. The choice isn't made once in some dramatic moment. It's made daily, in small decisions that shape who you're becoming. Every time you stand up for what's right when it's easier to stay silent. Every time you question authority when everyone else complies. Every time you refuse to dehumanize others, even when they've been labeled as enemies. You're choosing the heroic path. Jung believed that acknowledging your shadow self doesn't make you weaker, it makes you stronger and more whole. Nietzsche's Übermensch wasn't someone who had no capacity for evil, but someone who consciously chose to create values through authentic self-examination and moral courage. The question isn't whether you could become a monster. The research shows you could. The question is, what are you doing today to ensure you become a hero instead? The line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and the battle for your moral soul is fought daily in choices that might seem small, but are actually profound. So the next time you find yourself at a moral crossroads, and you will, remember Zimbardo's lesson. You have the power to resist, to question, to act heroically even when the situation pressures you toward darkness. The choice, as it always has been, is yours.